Silas Vardell slammed the folded papers onto the counter so hard the coffee cups rattled. "You missed your payment, Marietta." He didn't say it like a man delivering news. He said it like a man who had been waiting a long time to say it. His smile was the worst part. Calm, patient, satisfied. "I own your mortgage now. Every acre, every fence post, every drop of water from that spring. You have 8 days." Marietta's hands went cold. She had worked 3 brutal winters for this land. She had buried her husband in this soil. And now the most powerful man in the valley was standing in her kitchen wearing the expression of someone who had already won. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that a 25-year-old drifting cowboy standing quietly in the doorway had already read every word of that mortgage agreement. If you've ever fought to hold on to something that mattered, a home, a dream, a second chance at living, stay with me. This story is for you. Before you go further, if this is the kind of story that hits you somewhere deep, please subscribe to this channel. Every week I bring you stories about ordinary people who refuse to be broken. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Callum Rourke rode through the gate of Silver Briar Ranch, Marietta Vale was elbow deep in a problem she had no clean answer for. She had 11 dead cattle. She had feed bills she couldn't pay. She had a bank in Casper that had been patient for exactly as long as bankers are ever patient, which is to say, not very long at all. And she had neighbors who watched her from a careful distance the way people watch a fire, close enough to feel the heat, far enough not to get burned. She did not have time for a stranger. She was standing at the east fence line when she heard the horse, and she didn't look up right away. She was wrapping wire around a post with her bare hands because she'd already lost one good glove somewhere in the snow and couldn't afford to stop working long enough to find it. The cold had turned her fingers pink and stupid, but she kept wrapping. "Ma'am." She looked up. He was younger than she expected, much younger, sitting on a roan horse with more patience than the horse deserved, wearing a coat that had seen better years and a hat that fit him like it had been borrowed from someone taller. His face was windburned and unshaved, and he had the particular look of a man who had been traveling long enough that stopping felt strange. "I'm looking for Silver Briar Ranch," he said. "You found it." He glanced at the fence she was wrapping, then back at her. "I heard in town you might be looking for seasonal work. I'm a hard worker, and I don't complain. I can start today if you want." Marietta studied him for a moment. She had heard that line before. Every young man who came looking for ranch work was a hard worker who didn't complain. They were hard workers right up until the 3rd week of January when the temperature dropped below 0, and the cows were sick, and the well pump froze, and there was still a full day of work that needed doing before sunrise. Then they became something else entirely. "How old are you?" she asked. 25. She turned back to the fence. "I've hired young men before." "I imagine you have." "Most of them leave." "I imagine they do." She stopped wrapping. There was something in the way he said it, not defensive, not eager to prove himself, just level and plain, that made her pay attention. She looked at him again. His hands on the reins were working hands. She knew the difference between hands that had done work and hands that looked like they had. "Week's trial," she said. "You sleep in the bunkhouse, you eat what I cook, and if you break something, you fix it. You leave without notice, you leave without pay." "Fair enough." "What's your name?" "Callum Rourke." She told him where to put the horse and went back to the fence. She did not think about him again for the rest of that day, which was how she preferred it. The bunkhouse at Silver Briar had not housed anyone in 14 months. Marietta's last hired hand had left the previous November without a word of warning, taking 2 of her better tools with him when he went. She'd found the empty bunkhouse on a Tuesday morning and stood in the doorway for a long moment before closing it and walking back to the house and not speaking to anyone for the rest of the day. When Callum let himself in that evening, he did not complain about the cold or the dust or the broken window latch that let the wind in from the north. She knew because she was watching from the kitchen window. He simply built a fire in the small iron stove, propped the broken latch with a folded piece of leather from his saddlebag, and went to sleep. She'd expected to hear him moving around, making noise, doing the things young men do when they're alone and uncomfortable and trying to prove they aren't. She heard nothing. In the morning, he was already in the barn before she got there. She found him mucking out the 2 worst stalls. the ones she'd been putting off because they were foul and miserable work, and there was always something more urgent demanding her attention. He wasn't doing it to impress her. He was doing it because they clearly needed doing, and he was there. She stood in the barn door and watched him for a moment. "You've done this before," she said. "Started working on a ranch when I was 13. My father passed young. We needed the money." He didn't look up from what he was doing. "I know cows, and I know fence work, and I know what winter does to a property if you let it get ahead of you. Silver Briar is already behind." "I can see that." He finally looked at her, not with judgment, not with pity, just with the particular directness of someone who has seen hard times up close and isn't frightened by them. "I can help you catch up." Marietta did not say thank you. She went to get the morning feed. Awesome. By the end of the first week, she had stopped thinking of him as temporary. She didn't say that to anyone. She didn't even say it to herself in so many words. But there was a kind of ease that had settled over the ranch work that hadn't been there since before Thomas died, and she noticed it the way you notice weather, not by looking for it, but by the way it changes how you feel when you step outside. Callum did not offer opinions she didn't ask for. He did not rearrange her system for doing things into his system for doing things. He learned how she wanted the cattle managed, and he managed them that way. When he thought she'd made an error, and once or twice she had, he didn't announce it. He asked a question that made her look at the problem again and find the error herself. She was not used to being treated like a person who could reason. Most of the people in Dry Creek treated her like a problem that hadn't been solved yet. The widow who should have sold by now. The woman who was clearly struggling and clearly too stubborn to admit it. Half the town had quietly expected her to fail, and the other half had been waiting for her to accept some offer or arrangement that would make her failure easier for everyone to manage. Nobody had been waiting for her to succeed. Not really. Not in a way that helped. Callum just showed up and worked. The night that changed everything came in the third week, though Marietta would have argued later that she didn't realize it was changing anything at the time. She was asleep, not deeply, the way she never slept deeply anymore, when she heard the cow. A ranch woman knows the difference between the sound of normal cattle at night and the sound of an animal in trouble. Marietta was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake, her brain still catching up to her body as she crossed the yard in the cold dark. Callum was already in the barn. He had a lantern up, and he'd positioned himself at the back of the stall, and when Marietta came through the door, he turned to her and said, in a very calm voice, "First calf of the year. She's struggling. I didn't want to start without you." She took in the situation in about 4 seconds. The heifer was young, this was her first delivery, and the calf was not positioned correctly. This was going to be difficult. It was probably going to be bloody. There was a real chance they'd lose the calf, and a smaller but real chance they'd lose the cow too. "Hold her steady," Marietta said. "Right there. Don't let her roll." "Yes, ma'am." He did exactly what she said. He braced the animal with his whole body, using his weight and his strength and his calm. Because cows feel human panic, they feel it and respond to it. And Callum had a stillness in him that the frightened animal seemed to reach for like warmth. Marietta worked. She had done this before. She had done it with Thomas beside her. And she had done it alone in the 2 years after Thomas died. And she had done it scared and cold and exhausted. And she did it now with the same grim determination that had become the foundation of everything she was. It took 40 minutes. At the end of those 40 minutes, a wet and indignant calf hit the straw and started breathing, and the young cow turned her head and made a sound that was low and wondering and completely unmistakable. Marietta sat back on her heels and tried to catch her own breath. Callum looked at the calf. Then he looked at her. And he said very quietly, "You did that. Not we. Not we did that together. You." Marietta didn't answer. She was looking at the calf and listening to it breathe and feeling something move through her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time and didn't quite have a name for. Dawn came slowly that morning, the way Wyoming dawn comes in February, gray first, then a thin cold light that doesn't commit to anything. They were both sitting on hay bales at the edge of the stall, exhausted and covered in things she preferred not to name, and the calf was nursing shakily on its legs, and neither of them had spoken in a while. It was Marietta who broke the silence. "Most hired men want to take over," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the calf. "They see a woman struggling and they assume the answer is to handle it for her. Callum thought about that for a moment. That wasn't your struggle, he said finally. That was your cow, your ranch. You knew what you were doing. I just needed to be useful. She looked at him then. He was not saying it to impress her. She could tell the difference by now. He was saying it because it was simply what he thought. I'll make breakfast, she said, and she stood up and went inside. She made enough eggs for 2. The problem with Dry Creek was that it was small in the way that only a town of 400 people can be truly, relentlessly small. People knew your business before you finished having it. They had opinions about you that they'd developed years ago and had no particular interest in updating. And they talked, not maliciously, most of them, just constantly, the way people do when there isn't enough other noise in the world. By April, people in town had started noticing that Silver Briar was looking different. The fences were repaired. The cattle numbers were stabilizing. Marietta was coming to town with purpose rather than with desperation written across her face. And she had a hired man. A young hired man. Martha Collins from the dry goods store mentioned it to her husband. Her husband mentioned it to the men at the feed store. By the time it made one full circuit of Dry Creek, the story had already begun to take on a shape that had nothing to do with calving or fence repair or anyone's cattle operation. Marietta heard about it the way she always heard about town talk, sideways, in fragments, through the particular kind of careful silence that falls when you walk into a room and people were just speaking about you. She said nothing about it. She kept her head level and her transactions businesslike, and she went home. But that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the day's accounts in front of her, she became aware of something she had not let herself be aware of before. She had started looking forward to supper, not because she was hungry. She was often hungry and had never particularly looked forward to it, but because Callum came in from the evening work and washed his hands at the pump and sat across from her at the table. And the house felt less like a place where someone used to live and more like a place where someone lived now. She looked at the chair at the end of the table, Thomas's chair. Callum had never sat in it, not once, not even on the evenings when every other chair at the table was occupied with account books and ranch records, and he'd had to angle his plate awkwardly on the corner. He simply worked around it, without ever being told to, without ever commenting on it. She had not thanked him for that. She wasn't sure she could have explained why it mattered, even if she'd tried. By May, the tension between what the ranch needed and what the town thought about it had settled into a low, persistent hum in the back of Marietta's mind. She managed it. She was good at managing things. What she was not good at managing was the moment in mid-May when she came in from the east pasture and found Callum sitting on the porch steps in the evening light, actually reading, from a small cloth-bound book that looked like it had been carried a long distance. And something about the plainness of it, the simple normalness of a person being quietly at home in a place, hit her somewhere she wasn't expecting. She had thought his kind of person was always leaving. He was still here. She sat down on the steps beside him without quite deciding to. And they sat in the cooling evening while the light went to gold and then orange and the cattle moved in the lower pasture below them. And neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything. And Marietta could not have told you exactly when that stopped being unusual and started being the best part of her day. You could have left by now, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It just came out. He closed the book. He thought about it honestly, the way he did everything. I could have. You had enough money to move on 2 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, actually. She absorbed that. Then why are you still here? He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that isn't avoidance, but is something closer to a person being careful with something that matters. I think you already know why, he said. She stood up from the steps. Her heart was beating too fast and she didn't want him to see it. I'm going to finish the accounts, she said. She went inside. She stood at the kitchen counter for a full minute before she moved again. She was 42 years old. She had a ranch that was barely surviving. She had a town full of people already manufacturing stories about her. And she had a 25-year-old man sitting on her porch who had just told her, as plainly as he told her anything, that he was staying for her. She pulled the account books toward her and picked up her pen. Her hands were not entirely steady. She let herself not deal with it for 2 more weeks. She was honest enough with herself to know that's what she was doing. Not dealing with it, not resolving it, just working alongside it. The way you work alongside a bruise that isn't serious enough to stop you, but reminds you it's there every time you move wrong. The morning she realized she had made 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it, had reached for the second cup automatically, the way you reach for something that belongs in a particular spot in your life. She stood at the stove and looked at both cups and felt something break open quietly in her chest. She was not ready for this. She was also, she admitted to herself with a certain exhausted honesty, already in it. She carried both cups outside. Callum was at the water pump, working the handle, and he looked up when he heard her boots on the porch. She held out the second cup. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. He took it without saying anything. They stood at the pump in the early morning and drank their coffee and watched the light move across the valley below them. And Marietta thought, this is going to cost me something. She just hadn't figured out yet whether that was a reason to stop or a reason to keep going. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that they were already being watched. And the man watching had decided that a surviving ranch was considerably more dangerous to his plans than a failing one. The second cup of coffee became a habit neither of them named. That was the thing about the way it developed between them. Nothing was announced. Nothing was decided out loud. It simply accumulated the way snow accumulates, one quiet layer at a time. Until one morning you look out and realize the whole landscape has changed while you weren't watching it. Marietta would pour 2 cups and set one at the edge of the counter nearest the door, and Callum would come in from the morning check and pick it up, and they would stand in the kitchen for 10 or 15 minutes talking about the day's work. And that was all it was, on the surface. Just 2 people planning a working day. Except that Marietta had started waking up earlier than she needed to, and she was honest enough with herself to know why. She did not examine that too closely. She had a ranch to run. June came in warm and dry, which in Wyoming meant you started watching the sky with a particular kind of wariness, because warm and dry in June could turn into something much worse by August. Callum noticed it too. She could tell because he started checking the water levels in the upper pasture tank every morning without being asked, and he'd taken to riding the fence line along the creek more often than the schedule strictly required. "You're thinking about the water," she said one evening. It wasn't a question. "Everybody in the valley should be thinking about the water," he said. He was looking at the hills to the west, the way he sometimes did, like he was reading something in the shape of them. "It's going to be a dry summer. It was dry last summer. This one's going to be worse." He paused. "That spring in your upper pasture, how long has it been reliable?" Marietta thought about it. "Far back as I know. Thomas's father said it never ran dry, even in the bad summers." Callum nodded slowly, and she noticed something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not worry exactly, but a kind of sharpened attention, like a man who has just heard something important without fully understanding yet why it's important. "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." And he went to finish the evening work. She thought about that conversation later, lying awake in the dark the way she did most nights. The spring in the upper pasture had always been the quiet backbone of Silver Briar, the thing that kept the ranch viable in dry years when other operations in the valley were hauling water and losing cattle and making desperate decisions. Thomas had understood its value. She had always understood its value. She had not thought about whether anyone else understood its value. She pushed that thought aside and went to sleep. She was good at pushing things aside. She had built her entire last 3 years on the practice of it. The first time someone in town said something to her face, it was Dora Hutchins, who ran the millinery and had opinions about everything and the confidence to share all of them freely. Marietta was picking up thread and 2 yards of canvas when Dora appeared beside her with the particular bright-eyed energy of a woman about to say something she had already rehearsed. "Marietta, I just have to ask, and I hope you know I ask as a friend, that young man out at Silver Briar. How young is he exactly?" Marietta set the thread on the counter. "Young enough to do the work. People are talking. People in Dry Creek talk about everything. Last spring they spent 2 weeks talking about whether the Muller boys' new horse was the right color." She counted out her coins. "I imagine they'll find something else soon enough." Dora lowered her voice, which somehow made it carry further. "Marietta, you're a widow, and he's, 25? People are going to wonder. They're already wondering. I just think you should know." Marietta looked at her directly. Dora had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Dora," Marietta said, "my cattle are healthy, my fences are mended, and my spring calving was the best I've had in 4 years. If people want to spend their time wondering about my hired hand instead of their own business, That seems like a problem with their time management, not with mine. She picked up her package and left. She walked the entire length of Main Street before her hands stopped being tight at her sides. What she hadn't said to Dora, what she hadn't said to anyone, because it was the kind of thing that felt too fragile to expose to other people's opinions, was that she was already struggling with it herself. Not the age difference exactly, not as a number, but as a feeling, the persistent, uncomfortable sense that she was standing in front of something real and good while simultaneously being absolutely certain she was too late for it, that she had already used up whatever portion of the world's good things had been allocated to her, and that reaching for more was the kind of thing that happened to other people, younger people, people who hadn't already had their story. She thought about it on a Saturday afternoon when she was repairing the water trough, and Callum was working 20 yards away replacing a fence post, and she found herself watching him work for a moment without meaning to. The way he moved was economical, no wasted motion, the kind of physical knowledge that comes from years of doing hard work and learning what your body can and cannot do. He was 25. In 17 years, she would be nearly 60, and he would be 42, the age she was right now, and she did not know what to do with that arithmetic. She went back to the water trough. That evening, after supper, she didn't take her account books out immediately the way she usually did. She sat at the table for a moment longer than usual, and Callum was getting up to take his plate to the basin, and she said it before she quite made the decision to say it. "How old do you think I am?" He stopped, set his plate back down. He didn't look confused by the question. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular conversation to arrive and was deciding how to meet it. 42, he said. "You told me when I asked your name." "You asked my name, not my age." "You volunteered it," he said. "First week. You were telling me how long you'd been running the ranch alone. You did the math out loud." She hadn't remembered that. "And that doesn't bother you?" It wasn't quite a question. He heard it for what it was anyway. He sat back down. He put his elbows on the table, which he usually didn't do, and he looked at her the way he did when he was being careful about something. "You want me to tell you it doesn't matter," he said. "But you won't believe me if I say it that way, so I'm going to say it the other way." He paused. "I've spent the last 4 months working beside you. I've seen you stay up all night with a sick cow and still do a full day's work after. I've seen you go over your accounts 3 times looking for a number that isn't there. I've seen you talk to your late husband's horse like he can still hear you, which—" and here something shifted slightly in his expression, something that wasn't quite a smile but was close to one, "I don't think is strange. I think it means you're the kind of person who keeps faith with things, even when they can't give anything back." Marietta did not say anything. "What I'm trying to say," Callum continued, and his voice was quieter now, level the way it always was, but with something underneath it that she recognized because she'd been hearing it in herself for weeks, "is that when I look at you, I don't see a number. I see a person I respect. And I stopped pretending to myself a while ago that it's only respect." The kitchen was very quiet. "You're too young," Marietta said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "For a widow my age. You should be—" She stopped. She didn't actually know how to finish that sentence. She didn't know what he should be doing instead, which was part of the problem. "To me," he said, "you're exactly the woman I want." She stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the dark yard because she needed to not be looking at him for a moment. "Callum, I'm not asking you for anything right now," he said. She could hear him, but she didn't turn around. "I'm not expecting anything. I wasn't going to keep not saying it. That felt dishonest, and I don't want to be dishonest with you." She stood at the window for a long time. "Good night," she said finally. "Good night, Marietta." She heard him go out. She stood at the window for a while longer, looking at nothing, and then she went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle into the night and thought about the fact that a 25-year-old man who could ride away tomorrow and start over somewhere and be perfectly fine had just told her she was exactly the woman he wanted, and the most frightening part of it, the part that kept her staring at the ceiling, was that she believed him. She tried distance. It was not her best plan, but it was the plan she had. She kept their mornings professional. She gave him work assignments instead of having conversations. She stopped sitting on the porch in the evenings and found things to do inside the house that kept her occupied until it was reasonable to go to bed. She was polite. She was efficient. She told herself, being sensible. Callum let her do it for a week without comment. Then one morning she came in from the barn, and there was a problem with the account books. She'd found a discrepancy she couldn't trace, and she'd been staring at it for an hour before she gave up and brought them to the kitchen table. And she was still staring at it when Callum came in for the mid-morning break and glanced at what she was doing and said, without being asked, "Third column down. You carried the wrong number from March." She looked. He was right. She fixed it. He poured himself water and didn't say anything else about it, and she realized, sitting there with the corrected figure in front of her, that the distance she'd been maintaining was costing her something. Not just the obvious thing, not just the comfort of the evenings and the ease of the mornings, but something more specific. It was costing her the particular relief of being around a person who saw you clearly and wasn't troubled by what they saw. She had forgotten what that felt like before Callum. She did not want to forget it again. She did not lower the wall all at once. That was not how she did things. But she stopped working so hard to keep it standing, and that turned out to be enough. July burned. The creek ran lower than anyone had seen it in a decade. The grass on the south-facing slopes went dry and yellow by the third week of the month, and the cattle were moving differently, restless, following water rather than grazing with any purpose. 3 ranches in the lower valley started hauling water from Casper, which cost money nobody had plenty of, and people's tempers got short in the particular way they do when hard work keeps producing results that feel worse than nothing. Through all of it, Silver Briar's upper spring kept running. It was not a large spring, it couldn't water the whole ranch indefinitely, but it was steady, which in a drought year was its own kind of miracle. Callum had rigged a gravity feed from the spring to the main pasture tank weeks earlier, a simple system that saved hours of daily hauling, and the cattle were in better shape than most of the neighboring herds. Marietta knew she was lucky. She also knew luck in Wyoming doesn't stay quiet. The first indication that something was shifting came on a Tuesday afternoon when she rode into Dry Creek for supplies and found 2 men she didn't recognize having a careful conversation outside the land registry office. They weren't local. Their horses were too good and their clothes were too clean for working ranchers, and they stopped talking when she rode past in a way that felt deliberate. She didn't think much of it. Dry Creek got occasional strangers. What she thought about more was the fact that Silas Vardell, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and who she had not spoken to directly in almost a year, tipped his hat to her on the street that afternoon with a smile she did not trust. Silas Vardell did not smile at people he didn't want something from. She rode home with a low-grade unease that she couldn't quite articulate, and that evening at supper she told Callum about it in the matter-of-fact way she reported anything ranch-related. Callum was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "Vardell, he's the one who owns the water rights on the Perkins Range? He bought those out 3 years ago, just before the drought started. Smart timing, or good information." Callum looked at her. Did he ever approach Thomas about the spring? The question landed somewhere uncomfortable. Once, before Thomas passed, Thomas told him the spring wasn't for sale. Vardell seemed to accept it. Did he? It was not really a question. They both sat with that for a moment. "The mortgage on the ranch," Callum said carefully. "Who holds it now?" Marietta told him. "A lending institution out of Casper, one of 3 that handled most of the ranch mortgages in the territory. She'd been dealing with them for 6 years without particular incident." Callum nodded. He didn't say anything else, but that night she saw the lamp burning in the bunkhouse later than usual, and when she got up before dawn for the morning work, she passed by and heard the sound of pages turning. She did not ask him what he was reading. The conversation she'd been avoiding with herself finally happened in late July, on a night when the heat was too heavy to sleep, and she was sitting on the porch in the dark, and she heard Callum's boots on the steps, and knew without looking that he'd seen the lamp in her window and come out. He sat down on the steps without asking if it was all right. That was new. 3 weeks ago, he would have asked. "You're not sleeping," he said. "I don't sleep well in July." "You don't sleep well in February either, or May." She almost laughed. "You've been paying attention." "I've been paying attention since February," he said. They sat in the dark. The air smelled like dry grass and something faintly electrical, the smell of land under pressure. Out in the lower pasture, one of the cows made a low sound and went quiet. "I think about Thomas sometimes," Marietta said. She didn't know why she said it, except that it was true and she was tired of managing everything she said. I'm not comparing. It's not like that. It's more that I wonder what he would think." What do you think he'd think? Callum asked. I think he'd say I was being an idiot about it. She paused. He was practical. He didn't believe in wasting things. Wasting things, Callum repeated quietly. Time. Possibility. She exhaled. He would have liked you. That's the strange part. He would have respected how you work. I would have liked him, Callum said, from what I can tell. A silence, but a different kind of silence than before. I'm scared, Marietta said. She said it plainly because there was no other way to say it that would be honest. Not of you, of what it costs. Everything costs something. The ranch cost Thomas his health for the last 2 years of his life. Letting people matter to you costs you every time one of them leaves, or... She stopped. I got comfortable with the loneliness. That sounds terrible, but it's true. Loneliness is predictable. It doesn't surprise you. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I understand that better than you probably think. She looked at him. My father died when I was 11, he said. He didn't say it like a story he was trying to tell. He said it like a fact he was placing down between them carefully. My mother held things together for 2 years after that, and then she couldn't, and we moved 4 times in 3 years. I started working for wages at 13 because I was the oldest and we needed it. And somewhere in all of that, he paused. He was looking out at the dark hills. I learned not to settle into places, because every place we'd settled into had eventually come apart. So I just kept moving. Before the place could leave me, I'd leave it first. And then you stopped here, Marietta said. And then I stopped here. She looked at his profile in the dark. He was young. She knew he was young. But the young man she'd hired in February because she needed help with the calving was not quite the person sitting next to her now, or maybe she just hadn't seen him clearly before. Or maybe both of those things were true simultaneously. The chair at the end of the table, she said. Thomas's chair. You've never sat in it. No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because some places belong to memories until the person carrying those memories decides otherwise. That's not my decision to make. Marietta sat with that for a long time. She could feel the warmth of him beside her in the dark, the ordinary human warmth of a person who was present and real. And she thought about 2 cups of coffee and corrected account books and the weight of being seen clearly by someone who was not frightened by what they saw. I'm not promising anything, she said finally. I need you to understand that. I understand it. And you need to stop looking at me like the way you look at me sometimes, in front of other people. Somebody's going to say something. Somebody's already saying something, he said. And she heard it in his voice, not amusement exactly, but a kind of settled acceptance that told her he had already thought this through more than she had. That doesn't bother you? It bothers me that it bothers you, he said. The rest of it, what people in Dry Creek think, no, not particularly. She stood up. The boards of the porch were warm even now, at this hour, soaked through with the day's heat. Good night, Callum, she said. Good night. She went inside. She did not pour 2 cups of coffee this time because it was the middle of the night and there was no coffee, but she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the back of Thomas's chair, and she thought, I am 42 years old, and I am terrified, and I am not dead yet, and both of those things can be true at the same time. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. August arrived and the town arrived with it, fully formed and committed to its opinion. It was not one single event, but a series of them. The way social pressure usually works, not as a wave, but as a tide, persistent, coming from multiple directions, impossible to argue with directly because it had no single face. Martha at the dry goods store started finding reasons her deliveries were delayed. The Perkins family, who ran cattle on the adjacent range and who had always been civil if not warm, stopped acknowledging Marietta on the road. Reverend Holloway, who she liked, generally, mentioned in a Sunday gathering that certain situations required a woman to think carefully about her reputation as well as her ranch. That one hit harder than she expected. She was quiet all the way home. Callum drove the wagon and didn't push her, which she had come to understand was its own kind of kindness. He knew the difference between a silence that wanted to be filled and one that needed to breathe. He didn't say anything untrue, she said finally, when they were 2 miles from the ranch. About reputation, about how it works. No, Callum agreed. He didn't. If this keeps up, She stopped, started again. There are people in this valley I've known for 20 years, people Thomas knew, and they're looking at me differently. Yes. And you're not worried about that. I'm worried about you, he said. That's different. She turned her head to look at him. He was watching the road, managing the horses, the same way he did everything, steadily, without drama. I don't need you to worry about me, she said. I know you don't need me to. I do it anyway. He glanced at her briefly. That's also different. She faced forward again. The ranch appeared ahead of them, the buildings low against the pale late summer hills, and something about the sight of it, her land, her fences, the spring she could not quite see from here but knew was running steadily up in the high pasture, settled something in her chest. She had not worked 3 years of brutal winters and lost her husband and rebuilt what she could rebuild just to let other people's opinions define what came next. That thought was not new, but it felt newly sharp. It was the 3rd week of August when she made the decision. Not dramatically, not in a moment of cinematic clarity with the sun at the right angle. She made it in the morning, putting on her boots, when she realized she had stopped being afraid of the thing she wanted and had started being more afraid of not taking it. She found Callum at the east gate, where he was fixing a latch that had been giving them trouble all summer. She said, I need to say something and I need you to just listen first. He set down his tools. He turned to face her. He listened. I think you're right that I already know why you stayed, she said. And I think... She stopped. This was harder with his full attention on her. She made herself keep going. I think I've been waiting for the feeling to go away on its own, because that would be easier than deciding what to do about it. And it hasn't gone away. He waited. I'm 42, she said. You're 25. The math doesn't get better over time. And this town has already started. You've heard the talk. I know you have. So I need you to be honest with me about whether you've actually thought about what this looks like in 5 years, 10 years, because I don't want you to say something now that you can't stand behind later. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in 5 years I'll be 30. In 10 years I'll be 35. In both cases, you'll still be the person I want to be working beside and living with and building something with. The arithmetic doesn't change what I know. He paused. I've thought about it. I've thought about it more than you probably realize because I knew it was the thing you'd bring up. It's a fair thing to bring up. It's a fair thing to bring up, he agreed. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all, but I'm saying it doesn't matter the way you think it does. Not to me. Marietta looked at him. He was standing in front of her with his work gloves in his hand and a smear of Axle grease on his forearm and his hat pushed back slightly because he'd been working in close quarters. And he was 25 years old and he was looking at her with absolute steady certainty. And she thought, I have spent 3 years making decisions alone that were good decisions, and this is also a good decision, and I'm going to stop arguing myself out of it. All right, she said. He looked at her carefully. All right, meaning all right, she said. Don't make me explain it. Something crossed his face. Not triumph, nothing so sharp as that. Relief, maybe. The particular relief of a person who has been patient for a long time and finally doesn't have to be anymore. Okay, he said. The town's going to have a lot to say about it. Let them. She turned to go back to the morning work, and she was 3 steps away when he said, Marietta. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for not pretending the arithmetic doesn't exist. I know it cost you something to say it anyway. She stood with her back to him for a moment. Don't make me cry in the east pasture, she said. I have a reputation to protect. She heard him laugh, a real one, low and surprised, and she walked back toward the barn with her shoulders level and her jaw set, and something warm and frightening and completely alive moving through her chest. 3 weeks later, a rider came to Silver Briar with a legal notice. The mortgage on the ranch had changed hands, and the name at the top of the document was Silas Vardell. The rider left without waiting for a response, which told Marietta everything she needed to know about the kind of message he'd been paid to deliver. She stood in the yard holding the legal notice with both hands, reading it twice because the first time her eyes moved over the words without quite landing on them. The document was proper. It had the right stamps and the right signatures and the right formal language that legal papers use when they want to remind you that the law is a thing that exists and currently has opinions about your life. The mortgage on Silver Briar Ranch had been purchased from the Casper Lending Institution by a holding company, And the holding company's principal was Silas Vardell, and the document informed her that a payment review had identified a missed installment from the previous spring, and that Mr. Vardell, as the new mortgage holder, was exercising his right to demand a full accounting and potential acceleration of the remaining debt. She read that last part 3 times. Acceleration of the remaining debt. She knew what that meant. It meant the whole balance. Not the monthly payment, all of it. The number that was sitting at the back of her account books. Like a door she kept closed because opening it too often didn't help anything. Callum was at the well when she walked out to him. She handed him the document without saying anything. He read it standing up, the way he read everything. Straight through, no expression, taking it in before he responded to it. She watched his face while he read it and saw the exact moment he hit the acceleration clause because his jaw tightened slightly, just slightly, and then his face went level again. He handed it back to her. "How much is the remaining balance?" he asked. She told him. I was quiet for a moment. "And the payment he's claiming you missed, I didn't miss it." She said it flat and certain because she was flat and certain about it. She had never missed a mortgage payment in 6 years. Not when Thomas was sick, not in the first winter after he died, not when the cattle losses had made the math almost impossible. She had moved money from places she could barely afford to move it from, and she had made every single payment. I have the receipt. I have it in the tin box in the study, with every other receipt going back to the start. Callum nodded. "Can I see the original mortgage agreement, the full document?" She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to read it." "Callum, it's 40 pages of legal language. I paid an attorney in Casper to review it when we signed it, and he said it was standard." "I know," he said. "I'd still like to read it." She did not ask him again why. She went and got it. That night, while Marietta sat at the kitchen table going through every receipt in the tin box and organizing them by date, Callum sat across from her with the mortgage agreement open in front of him and read every word of it. Not quickly, not skimming. He read with the particular focused stillness of a man who is looking for something specific and knows it might be hidden in language designed to obscure it. She watched him between her own work and did not interrupt. Around 10 o'clock he looked up. "When did you make the payment he's claiming you missed?" "March 14th. I have the receipt right here." She slid it across the table. He looked at it carefully. "And the due date was the 15th. I always paid a day early." He set the receipt down. He looked back at the mortgage agreement and turned several pages. She could see him reading a particular section twice. "What is it?" she said. "Just reading." He kept his eyes on the page. "Callum." He looked up. He had an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not alarm, not satisfaction, but something more careful than either, something like a man who has found a thread in a piece of cloth and is deciding whether pulling it will help or make things worse before he knows where it goes. "Let me finish reading it," he said. "Tonight. I'll tell you in the morning what I think." She wanted to press him. She didn't. She took her receipts and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the lamp burn in the kitchen for another 2 hours before she finally heard him close the document and go out to the bunkhouse. She did not sleep much. In the morning, he was at the kitchen table before she was, which was unusual enough that she stopped in the doorway when she came down. He had the mortgage agreement open again, and beside it he'd written several lines on a piece of paper in his careful, plain handwriting. She poured the coffee. Both cups. She set one in front of him. "Tell me," she said. He looked at his notes for a moment, organizing the order of it. "When Vardell purchased the mortgage," he said, "he purchased it with all its original terms intact. He can't change those terms without your agreement. The original agreement spells out what a default situation looks like and what the lender can do about it." "I know that," the attorney told me. "But did he tell you the specific conditions required before the lender can accelerate the full balance?" She looked at him. "It said missed payments." "It says," Callum corrected quietly, picking up the document and finding the page without looking, 2 consecutive missed payments, followed by a written notice of 30 days, before acceleration of the full balance can be legally demanded. He looked up at her. 2 consecutive, not 1. And 30 days written notice. Marietta stared at him. "That notice arrived yesterday," he continued, "and the document says 8 days. The kitchen was very still. "He's wrong," she said. Not loudly. She said it the way you say something when your brain is trying to catch up to what your understanding already knows. "He's either wrong Or he's hoping you don't know you're right, Callum said. Which amounts to the same problem in practice, because if you don't challenge it with the correct information, wrong and right don't matter. Marietta stood up. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment. And she was not looking at the yard, she was looking at nothing, because her brain was working fast and she needed to let it work. Vardell had bought the mortgage. That was real. He had the money and the connections to do that. And he'd done it quietly enough that she hadn't known until the notice arrived, which meant he'd been planning it for longer than a few weeks. He'd looked at Silver Briar's debt and seen a lever he could pull, and he'd pulled it, and he had apparently done it assuming that a widow in a drought year with a controversial hired man and a town that was already whispering about her would be too overwhelmed, too isolated, too frightened to read the fine print of her own mortgage agreement. She turned around. "I need to go to the county seat," she said. "I need to see an attorney." "Yes." "I need every receipt, every payment record, every piece of paper that touches the ranch's finances going back 6 years." "I'll help you organize it today." She nodded. She was already moving, already thinking, the way she moved when there was a real problem that needed solving, and she could feel the shape of the solution somewhere in the work ahead. "Why do you know this?" she said abruptly. She stopped and looked at him. "The mortgage terms. The acceleration clause. How do you know how to read that?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said. He said it simply, no drama around it. "After my father died, she had 2 debts, one on the house, one a business loan my father had taken for equipment. The men who held those debts were not patient men. She didn't know what she'd signed or what her rights were, and they knew she didn't know, and they used that." He paused. "She lost the house. She shouldn't have. There were protections in the documents she never knew about because nobody helped her read them. I was 13 and I couldn't help her and I couldn't stop it." He looked at the mortgage agreement on the table. "I taught myself after that. Contracts. Debt agreements. Not because I planned to be a lawyer, just because I decided that if I ever had occasion to use the information, I'd rather have it than not." Marietta stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him and felt something shift in her understanding of who he was. Not a large shift, not a surprise exactly, but a deepening, like when you've been looking at something in poor light and someone moves the lamp and the thing hasn't changed, but you can see it fully for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your mother." "It was a long time ago," he said. But she could tell that it was the kind of long time ago that doesn't stop being a real distance no matter how many years you put between yourself and it. "All right," she said. "Let's go through everything." So, they spent the day at the kitchen table. It was not dramatic work. It was the kind of work that looks from the outside like nothing. 2 people with stacks of paper and an ink pen and a running list of dates and amounts, checking figures against figures, building a record that was already real but needed to be assembled into a form that could be placed in front of an attorney and understood quickly. Marietta pulled every receipt from the tin box. Callum checked each one against the ledger. When the numbers matched, he made a notation. When something wasn't immediately clear, they went back to the source documents until it was. The payment Vardell claimed she'd missed was there. March 14th, 1 day before the due date. The receipt was signed by the bank teller in Casper and had the bank's stamp on it. It was not ambiguous, but neither of them said it was over because finding the receipt was not the same as winning the argument. Vardell had money and connections and had already demonstrated a willingness to push past what was legal and hope nobody pushed back. The receipt mattered, but it would matter most in front of an attorney who could turn it into a formal response. Late in the afternoon, Callum set down his pen and looked at the organized stack of documents in front of them. "This is a strong record," he said. 6 years of payments, all on time, all documented. And the contract language is clear. He can't do what he's claiming to do." "Can't and won't are different things," Marietta said. "They are. That's why we need the attorney." She nodded slowly. She was looking at the stack of papers, 6 years of her life distilled into numbers and signatures and stamped dates, and she felt the exhaustion of it settle into her shoulders. Not defeat, not hopelessness, but the particular weariness of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is finally beginning to understand that the weight is not going to reduce itself through endurance alone. "He was waiting," she said. "Vardell, he bought the mortgage months ago, probably. He was waiting to see if we'd make it through the summer in good enough shape that it was worth doing something about." Callum was quiet. "Callum's being here," she said. She almost said you're being here, but she stopped herself. The ranch stabilizing, that's what made him move. That's how I read it, he said. She exhaled slowly. So he used the town's talk as cover and the mortgage as the weapon. He used both, Callum said. The talk was to make you more vulnerable before he moved. If you were already isolated and uncertain and people were already looking at you sideways, a legal notice arriving might just be enough to finish the thing without you fighting back. She looked at him. He underestimated me. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The particular expression of a man who has known something for a while and is glad to finally have it confirmed. He did, Callum said. Do. They left for the county seat before dawn 2 days later. Marietta had the document box. Callum had the horses ready. She came out of the house in the gray pre-dawn dark with a satchel of papers under one arm and her coat buttoned against the cold morning air, and for a moment she stopped on the porch and looked at the ranch, at the barn and the fences and the low hills behind them and the unseen springs somewhere in the high pasture running steadily in the dark. And she felt the kind of love for a place that doesn't need to be articulated because it lives in your chest and your hands, and the particular way you carry your body when you're standing on ground that belongs to you. She was not going to lose this. She got in the wagon. The drive to the county seat was 4 hours in good conditions. The conditions were reasonable. The road was dry, which was good, and the morning was cool enough that the horses moved well. Marietta drove the first 2 hours, and Callum drove the second 2, and they talked when there was something to say, and were quiet when there wasn't, and it was the kind of company that Marietta had forgotten was possible. The kind where another person's presence doesn't demand anything from you, doesn't require you to perform composure or manage their reaction to your worry, just exists alongside you steadily. She had a moment, about halfway there, where she thought about Silas Vardell sitting in his large house on his large property, deciding that she was a manageable problem, and the thought made something cold and clean move through her that she recognized as anger. She did not try to put it away. She let it settle into a useful shape. The attorney's name was Harlan Webb, and he was a compact, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 20 years being the calmest person in every crisis he'd been paid to address. His office was on the second floor of a building on the main street, and he saw them the same afternoon they arrived because Marietta had sent a telegram ahead. He read the notice from Vardell. He read the mortgage agreement. He examined the payment receipts. He did all of this without comment, in order, pausing once to ask Marietta to confirm a date, and once to ask Callum how he'd identified the acceleration clause issue, a question he asked without any particular surprise, just with the tone of a man who likes to understand the sequence of events he's being handed. Then he set everything down and looked at them over his glasses. The payment was made, he said. The receipt is clear, and the bank's stamp is valid. There is no missed payment. And the acceleration clause? Callum said. Even if there had been a missed payment, which there wasn't, the terms require 2 consecutive missed payments and a written notice of 30 days before full acceleration can be demanded. The notice Mr. Vardell sent gives 8 days. Webb set his glasses on the desk. He cannot legally do what he's attempting to do. Marietta let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for most of 2 days. What do we do? She said. We send a formal legal response, Webb said. It will be specific, and it will cite the relevant sections of the mortgage agreement, and it will include a copy of the payment receipt. I'll also be filing a formal notice with the county records documenting the receipt and the date, which creates a paper trail that protects you going forward regardless of what Vardell does next. He picked up his pen. I can have it drafted by tomorrow morning. Do it, Marietta said. I will. He looked at her levelly. I've dealt with Vardell before. Not directly, but I know his methods. He moves quickly, and he moves assuming the other party doesn't know their own rights. When they do, he retreats. He's not a man who likes a fight he can't win. He seems to like a fight he thinks he can win, Callum said. Yes, Webb agreed, which is why it's important that he understands clearly that this is not one of those situations. They stayed in the county seat that night, at a boarding house on the edge of town. Marietta took a room on the second floor. Callum's was down the hall. They had supper in the boarding house dining room at a table by the window, and neither of them talked much about the day's work because there was nothing new to say about it. The attorney had the documents, the response would be filed tomorrow, and the situation was as handled as it could be at this moment. So they talked about other things. She asked about the places he'd worked before Silver Briar, and he told her about a horse operation in Colorado and a cattle drive that had gone badly wrong in the Texas Panhandle, and a winter he'd spent as a line rider in Montana that had been so cold that he'd had to break the ice in his water basin every morning before he could wash his face. He had a way of telling these things, not with self-pity and not with false modesty, just as facts about a life that had moved through a lot of different landscapes before it arrived here. "Did you ever want to stay anywhere?" she asked. He thought about it genuinely, the way he considered most questions. "Once. Operation in Colorado, I mentioned. Decent people, good horses, fair wages. I stayed 8 months." "What made you leave?" He was quiet for a moment. Nothing happened. That was almost the problem. It was fine, it was good even. And I kept waiting to feel like I belonged there, and I didn't. And eventually I figured staying somewhere that felt like belonging and staying somewhere that was just comfortable were different things, and I stopped confusing them. Marietta turned her water glass in her hands. "And Silver Briar doesn't just feel comfortable." He looked at her across the table. "No," he said. "It doesn't just feel comfortable." She did not look away from that. She let it sit between them at the table and did not try to manage it or qualify it or turn it into something smaller than it was. "We should sleep," she said finally. "The attorney wants us there at 8. "Yes." She stood. He stood. They walked upstairs in the boarding house with the sound of other guests and the creak of old floors around them. And when they reached her door, she stopped. She had not planned to say what she said next, but she was tired of not saying things. "When this is over," she said, "and it is going to be over, when Vardell is handled and the mortgage is back where it belongs and the ranch is ours again, I don't want to go back to pretending that things are different than they are." He was quiet, watching her. "I've been managing myself about this," she said. "Managing the way I think about it, the way I talk about it, the way I let myself feel it. I'm very good at managing things. Too good, probably." She stopped. "You stayed. You told me why you stayed, and then I kept treating it like something I might have imagined because that was easier." "You didn't imagine it," he said. "I know." She looked at him directly. "I know I didn't." He was standing in the dim hallway of a boarding house in the county seat, and the light was poor, and he needed to shave, and he'd been in a wagon for 4 hours and sitting in an attorney's office being careful and precise for another 3. And he looked at her with the same steady certainty he had looked at her with from almost the beginning. The expression that said, "I have thought about this and I am sure, and you do not scare me, not your age, not your grief, not your difficulty believing this is real." "Go to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we finish this." She went inside. She lay in the unfamiliar bed and looked at the ceiling of a stranger's house and felt, against all reasonable expectation, something very close to peace. Webb's response was 4 pages long and precise as a surgical instrument. It cited the specific date and amount of the supposedly missed payment. It cited the bank receipt with the teller's name and the stamp. It cited the exact language of the acceleration clause, Section 4, Paragraph 3, subsections A and B, and laid out clearly and without embellishment why Vardell's 8-day demand was legally invalid by 2 distinct and separately sufficient reasons. It also included notice that any further attempt to act on the invalid demand would result in a formal complaint to the territorial court. Marietta read it at Webb's desk while Callum stood by the window, and Webb sat quietly with his hands folded, waiting for questions. "This covers everything?" she said. "It covers everything," Webb said. "He'll try again," Callum said from the window. He said it without heat, just as an observation. "When this particular move fails, he'll try again with something else." "He may," Webb agreed, "but each time he tries, it costs him something. Money, time, credibility with the people he has to work with. Men like Vardell rely heavily on the impression that they always win. Once that impression starts to crack, their leverage weakens." He paused. "And the water rights in your spring, I'd recommend having those formally documented and registered as part of the ranch property, if they aren't already. It closes a door he might otherwise try later." Marietta filed that away. "What do I owe you?" Webb told her. It was not cheap, but it was not impossible, and she had expected both of those things. She paid half that morning and arranged to pay the remainder when she was back. Webb showed her to the door, and when they were on the street outside with the morning sun on them, and the county seat going about its business around them, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Done, Callum said. Not done, she said, but better. He nodded. He knew the difference. The ride home was different from the ride out. The same road, the same distance, the same horses, but the air between them had shifted to something that no longer had the tight quality of a problem held in suspension. The problem was not gone, but it had been engaged directly, and that was its own kind of relief. About an hour from Silver Briar, Marietta said, "I want to understand what he was actually trying to do. The whole shape of it." "He was trying to take the ranch," Callum said. "I know that. I mean the method. He bought the mortgage. He waited. He used the town's talk to make sure I was already isolated before he moved. That's three separate things working together." She paused. "That takes planning. That takes patience." "He's been planning it since your husband died," Callum said. "Possibly before. The spring is worth a lot in a drought year. You know that." "I know that." He assumed a widow would eventually break under enough pressure. Financial pressure, social pressure, isolation. He just needed to wait and apply the right pressure at the right time. "And then you arrived," Marietta said. Callum glanced at her. "And then I arrived." She thought about that. She thought about the image of Silas Vardell, patient as stone, watching Silver Briar through 3 years of difficulty, waiting for the moment to move, and then watching, with whatever calculation lived behind that polished smile of his, as a 25-year-old drifting cowboy rode through the gate and the whole equation changed. "He misjudged on several counts," she said. "He did. He assumed the talk would break me. He didn't know you. He assumed you'd leave eventually. Young men always leave. He didn't know me either." She almost smiled. "And he assumed I wouldn't read my own mortgage." "He assumed," Callum said, with a precision that had something quietly satisfying in it, "that nobody would read it and understand what they were reading. He was wrong about that too." They were on Silver Briar's road now, the familiar curve of it, the gate coming into view ahead. The ranch was there the way it was always there. The same buildings, the same hills, the same fences that they had repaired together through spring and summer, the same pastures where the cattle were visible, moving in the late afternoon light. She reached across and put her hand briefly on his arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He kept driving, and they came through the gate together, and the ranch held the last of the afternoon light like it was something worth holding, which it was. The legal response reached Silas Vardell 4 days after they returned. Marietta knew it had arrived because she saw him in Dry Creek 2 days after that, and his expression when his eyes met hers across the street had changed. Not broken. Vardell was not a man who showed his losses openly, but different. The satisfied patience that had been in his face the last several times she'd seen him was gone, and in its place was the carefully blank expression of a man recalculating. He did not tip his hat this time. She did not look away first. The whispers in Dry Creek had started changing too, which she had not expected and had not been counting on. It had started, she thought, when Agnes Mueller, who was 70 years old and had no patience for nonsense and whose opinion in Dry Creek was weighted accordingly, had said in the dry goods store in a voice carrying enough for the whole room to hear that a woman who spent 3 years running a ranch alone through hard winters and drought and then fought off the biggest landowner in the valley over her own mortgage was not a woman who needed anyone's pity or anyone's management of her personal life. Agnes had then purchased her flour and left. Marietta heard about it secondhand from Callum, who had heard it from the man at the feed store who had been there when it happened. She listened to the story and did not say anything for a moment. "I like Agnes Mueller," she said finally. "I know," Callum said. "You've said that before." She had. Agnes was difficult and frequently blunt and occasionally incorrect, but she was honest in the way that people who have stopped caring about being liked are always honest. An honesty from a woman who had lived 70 years in one valley carried a weight that no amount of careful whispering could match. It did not fix everything. It did not suddenly restore every friendship or silence every opinion. Marietta was not naive about how these things worked in small places. Some people would always see her the way they had decided to see her, because changing your opinion about someone required admitting that the first opinion was formed too quickly or too unkindly, and that was a thing some people were not built for. But the tide had shifted. Not everything. Not everyone. Enough. 3 weeks after they returned from the county seat, on a Sunday evening when the summer heat had finally started to soften and the air from the hills was moving through the valley with the first suggestion of autumn in it. Marietta was sitting on the porch in the going light when she heard Callum's boots. She had come to know every different version of the sound of his footsteps. The working walk, the tired walk, the walk that meant something needed attention, and he was bringing her the information. This was none of those. This was unhurried and unworried, and just the sound of a person crossing the yard at the end of a day that had been a good day because it had been ordinary. He sat down on the porch steps. They sat in the cooling evening without speaking for a while, the comfortable silence she had stopped being surprised by. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the valley, not at her. He had one arm resting on his knee and his hat off, which he did sometimes in the evenings. And in profile in the going light, he looked like someone who had made a decision quietly and thoroughly and was now just saying it out loud. "Not yet," he said. I have something I want to ask you. Not tonight. I'm not asking tonight." She studied him. "But you're telling me you're going to ask." "I'm telling you I'm going to ask. So it's not a surprise when I do." She turned back to the valley. The last of the light was going gold on the hills, and the cattle were moving in the lower pasture, and the spring in the high pasture above them was running in the dark, steady as it had always been. And she had the receipt that proved the payment, and the attorney's response, and every fence Callum had mended, and every morning they had stood at the pump with their coffee, and every night the lamp had burned in the bunkhouse, while he read a mortgage agreement, looking for the thing that could save her land. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. They sat on the porch until the light was gone. The autumn that followed was the quietest kind of busy. The kind where there was always something that needed doing, and you did it, and the days had a shape to them that felt earned rather than imposed. September brought cooler mornings, and the first real relief from the drought's grip, though not enough rain to call it over, just enough to remind the land that water still existed somewhere above them and would eventually come back. The cattle were in better shape than they'd been in 2 years. The fences were sound, the upper spring was still running, steady as a promise kept, and Marietta had followed Webb's advice about formalizing the water rights, making a trip to the county office in early September with the relevant documents, and coming home with a registered claim that put Silver Briar's access to that spring into the official record in a way that would be considerably harder to challenge than a handshake and a history. Callum had suggested she do it quietly, without announcing it in town. She had agreed. There was no need to advertise that she'd closed a door. Better to simply close it and move on. Vardell had not made another move. Webb had said he might not, and so far Webb had been right. Marietta did not assume the matter was fully finished. She understood Vardell well enough by now to know that men of his particular kind didn't abandon ambition, they just redirected it toward easier targets when a difficult one turned out to have teeth. Silver Briar had teeth. He knew that now. She paid the second half of Webb's fee in October, which was the last large expense she hadn't accounted for, and when she crossed it off the ledger, she sat for a moment looking at the numbers on the page. They were not comfortable numbers. The ranch was not thriving in the way she had once imagined it might thrive. But it was stable, which 3 years ago had seemed as distant as another country. And stable was the ground you stood on when you were building toward something better. She closed the ledger. She went to make supper. It was a Tuesday in mid-October when the letter arrived from a ranch called the Alderman Operation, 2 counties east. It was addressed to Callum, which meant Marietta found it with the rest of the mail when she picked up from town and held it in her hand for a moment, looking at the return address without opening it, obviously, because it was not hers to open. She held it for a moment longer than she probably needed to, then put it with the rest of the mail and left it on the kitchen table and went to do the afternoon work. She did not say anything about it when Callum came in for supper. He saw it with the mail, the way you notice something that has your name on it, and he picked it up and read it while she was at the stove, and she kept her back to him and focused on what she was doing with a level of attention that the beans did not strictly require. He set the letter down. She heard him sit. She brought the food to the table and sat across from him, and they said grace in the comfortable way they had stopped thinking about, just a moment of quiet before eating, and she was reaching for the bread when he said, "Alderman Ranch wants me for their foreman position." She kept her hand moving. She took the bread. She put it on her plate. "That's a significant offer," she said. "It is." She looked at him. His face was not giving her much, which was unusual. Callum was generally readable to her by now in the way that people become readable when you've been paying close attention to them for months. But right now he was being careful in a way that made her careful too. "What does it pay?" she said. He told her. It was more than she paid him, considerably more, which was not a surprise because Silver Briar's budget was Silver Briar's budget and always had been, and a foreman position at an established operation with working capital and a full crew was simply going to be a different kind of offer. She knew that. She had always known that. "It's to the position beyond the wages," she said, because she was asking the practical questions, because if she let herself stop asking practical questions, she was going to say something she hadn't decided yet whether to say. "House on the property. Their own house, not bunkhouse." He paused. "Full authority over the cattle operation. They're expanding. Brought in 200 head from Montana last year, and they want to keep growing." Marietta nodded slowly. She was looking at her food. She was thinking about the fact that she had known, somewhere in the practical part of her mind that never fully went quiet, even when the rest of her was not being particularly practical, that this was the kind of offer that would eventually come. Callum was good, genuinely good, not just competent, but the kind of capable that other people in the ranching business noticed when they were paying attention. And the ranching business in Wyoming paid attention to talent, eventually, the way any industry does, because talent was scarce and everyone needed it. She had known. She had chosen him anyway. That had been the right choice. She did not regret it. But sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday in October listening to the terms of a life that could take him 2 counties away was its own particular education in the cost of choosing things you cannot control. "When do they need an answer?" she said. "End of the month." 2 weeks. She nodded again. "Marietta," he said. "Eat," she said. "It's getting cold." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. The expression of a man who has more to say and is deciding whether now is the right time to say it. Then he picked up his fork. They ate. She did not bring it up again that evening. She worked her accounts. He sat on the other side of the table, reading. And the kitchen had the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening, and she managed to be present in it without letting the thing she wasn't saying take up too much space. But that night she lay awake and thought about it with the particular honesty that the dark tends to encourage. He should take it. That was the plain truth of it, assembled from parts she could not argue with. He was 25 years old. A foreman position at an expanding operation was the kind of opportunity that built a life. Real financial ground, real authority, the kind of experience that would make him a landowner himself eventually if he wanted it. Silver Briar was stabilizing, but it was not growing, not yet, and she could not pay him what the alderman operation could pay him, and the house on the property meant independence in a way the Silver Briar bunkhouse did not. She thought about what she wanted, separately from what made sense. What she wanted was for him to stay. She was honest enough to admit that plainly, in the dark, to herself where no one could hear it, and where it didn't have to carry the weight of being said out loud. She had spent the better part of a year learning what it felt like to have him present in her life, and she knew now with the certainty that comes from having been without it, and then having it returned what his absence would mean. It would not break her. She was not the kind of person who broke, but it would cost her something she would feel for a long time. She also knew that she was not going to ask him to stay. She had thought about this too, and she had thought about it long enough to be sure of it. She was not going to be the reason he turned down an offer that was genuinely good for him. She was not going to make herself a weight he had to calculate against his own future. That was not what she wanted to be to him. If he stayed, she needed it to be a decision he made fully, knowing what he was choosing, not a decision he made because she had looked at him a certain way and he was too good a person to leave. She was aware that this was a harder position than it sounded, but she was also aware that it was the only one she could live with. She went to sleep eventually. She was not well rested in the morning, but she was clear. The week after the letter arrived was one of the stranger weeks in Marietta's recent memory, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quality of ordinariness that settled over everything. They worked, they ate, they talked about ranch business. She caught herself more than once watching him do some piece of ordinary work, mending a piece of harness, checking the cattle in the lower pasture, pumping water at the morning pump, and doing the things she'd been doing since February, which was noting the way he moved and the way he thought and the way he occupied a space, except now the noting had a different feeling to it, an awareness that she was doing it with a consciousness of potential endings that she hadn't had before. She hated that. She was not a person who lived well with anticipatory loss. She was better with actual loss, where the edges were clear and the work of surviving was defined. The anticipatory kind was vague and persistent, and it made it difficult to do accounts. She was very short with a fence post that gave her trouble on a Thursday. The fence post did not apologize, which she thought was reasonable. On Friday evening, Callum found her in the barn doing an inventory she had not strictly needed to do yet, and he stood in the door for a moment watching her work and then said, "You're avoiding me." "I'm doing inventory." "You did inventory last week," she kept writing. "I do it twice a month." He came into the barn. He found a hay bale and sat on it, which meant he wasn't leaving, which she'd expected because he was not a person who left a thing undone if he could help it. "You're allowed to say something," he said. "I've said plenty of things this week." "Not about the letter." She set down her pen. She turned around. I was sitting on the hay bale with his elbows on his knees, watching her with that level attention that had first startled her in February, when she'd been expecting something more eager and self-advertising. "I don't have anything useful to say about the letter," she said. "It's a good offer. You should think about it carefully." "I've thought about it." "And?" He held her gaze. "And I'm not going to take it." The barn was quiet. A horse shifted in the nearest stall. Marietta stood for a moment with her inventory book in her hands, looking at him, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for a week. Then she said, "Why?" Not a question exactly. She wanted to hear him say it. "Because I already told you why I stayed," he said. "That answer hasn't changed. The alderman offer is a good offer. It's more money and more authority and a better position by most measures I know how to use." He paused. "But it's not here." "That's not a complete answer." He stood up. He walked to where she was standing, and he stopped close enough that she could see the particular expression on his face. Not the careful levelness he used when he was being patient, but something more open than that. Something she didn't see from him often because he generally kept it at a careful distance from the surface. "I already told you," he said quietly, "that I stopped leaving before places could leave me. I told you Silver Briar was different. I meant it then and I mean it now, and I would like you to believe me when I say it." "I believe you," she said. "Then let me turn the letter down." She looked at him for a long moment. I was 25 years old, and he had ridden through her gate in February with a worn coat and borrowed-looking hat, and she had expected him to be like every other young man who had passed through, capable for a while and then gone. And he was standing in front of her in her own barn telling her that the alderman operation with its good wages and its foreman's house was not what he wanted, and she believed him. And she was afraid of how much she believed him. "You need to be sure," she said. "Not for me. For yourself." "I'm sure." "Callum." "Marietta." He said her name the same way she'd said his. A gentle interruption, a correction of the direction she was trying to take. "I have been sure for months. I've had this conversation with myself more times than you probably realize, because I knew eventually there'd be something like this. Another offer, another reason to go. And I knew I had to be able to say no to it clearly and mean it, not just because you were here, but because staying was the right thing." He paused. "It's the right thing. For me, not just for you." She set the inventory book down on the hay bale he'd vacated. She crossed her arms and looked at the middle distance for a moment, which was what she did when she was processing something she didn't have an argument for. "The wages are considerably better," she said finally. "I know. I can't match them. I know. I want you to know I understand that you're giving something up." "I know what I'm giving up," he said. "I also know what I'd be giving up if I went." She looked at him. "All right," she said. For the second time in their history, she said it that way. Those two plain words that were not a small thing, even if they sounded like one. He nodded once. He picked up the inventory book and held it out to her. "Finish your inventory," he said. "I'll check the water." She took the book. He went out. She stood in the barn for a moment after he left, holding the inventory book against her chest, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not relief exactly, though that was part of it, but something more substantial than relief. The feeling of a decision made with eyes open, by someone who had looked at all the options and come back anyway. She went back to work. He wrote the letter, declining the alderman position the following morning, and gave it to her to post when she went to town, which struck her as a deliberate gesture. He was not hiding the decision or making it quietly in a way she might wonder about later. He was handing it to her directly, making it shared in a way that meant something. She posted it without drama and came home, and they had supper, and the day continued. October turned to November, and the cold came back in earnest. With it came the particular arithmetic of a ranch preparing for winter. The feed stores to stock, the equipment to winterize, the cattle to move to the sheltered pastures, 1,000 small things that needed doing before the first hard freeze and would not get done by themselves. Marietta had done this arithmetic 3 times alone. Doing it with Callum was different in ways she had stopped trying not to notice. It was not that he did her work for her. He never had. He did his portion of the work, and she did hers, and the total of it was more than either could have managed separately, which was both the practical and the less than practical truth of another person being present in a life. She noticed it most clearly one afternoon in early November when she was in the kitchen going over the winter feed budget, and he came in from the barn with a problem. A section of the east roof had a joint that wasn't going to make it through a heavy snowfall. He'd found it during a check, and they needed to decide whether to repair it now before the freeze or brace it and plan a full fix in spring. He laid out both options with their costs and trade-offs the way he always laid things out, straightforwardly, without a preferred answer announced in advance, because he had understood early that what she needed was information and the space to make a decision, not a decision delivered to her. They talked through it for 20 minutes. They decided on the immediate repair because the cost of the brace failing midwinter was higher than the cost of the fix now. Then he went and did the fix, and she went back to the feed budget, and it was such an ordinary interaction that she almost missed the significance of it, almost missed noticing that she had just spent 20 minutes making a decision about her property with another person in the easy collaborative way of 2 people who trust each other's judgment and have earned that trust through months of being honest about what they knew and didn't know. She had done this with Thomas. A long time ago, in the early years. She had not done it with anyone since. She sat with that for a while. She did not try to make it into more than it was, or make it into less. The question came in December. Not the question she had been told to expect, or not exactly. She had been told it was coming, which should have prepared her. And it did prepare her in the way that knowing a winter is coming prepares you for winter, which is to say you understand the idea of it, and the reality still takes your breath. They had been in the barn, not a calving this time, just the evening check, the last round of the day, making sure everything was settled before full dark. The barn was warm in the way barns are warm in winter. Not comfortable exactly, but alive, with the heat of animals and the smell of hay and the sounds that a settled herd makes when the work of the day is finished. Callum was checking the younger cattle, and Marietta was at the far end looking at a heifer she'd been watching for 2 days. A heifer who was eating well enough, but had a look in her eye that Marietta didn't quite trust. And she was deep in that assessment when she heard him come up behind her and stop. She finished her look at the heifer and straightened up. "She's probably fine," she said. "I'll check her again in the morning." "Marietta," he said. Something in the way he said it made her turn around. He was standing in the barn with his hat in his hands, which she had not seen from him before. He always wore his hat or set it aside somewhere. He did not stand holding it like that. And the fact that he was doing it now was such a departure from his ordinary self that her stomach dropped slightly with the particular instinct of knowing that something significant is about to happen. He was not nervous exactly. He was too anchored for nervous. But he was holding the hat, and he was looking at her with an expression that was open in a way he normally kept managed, and she understood what was coming about 3 seconds before he said it. "I told you I had something to ask you," he said. "You did." "I've been thinking about how to say it right." "Callum." "I know. I'm getting there." He took a breath. "You are the most capable and most honest person I have been in close proximity to in my life. You are also stubborn in ways that are sometimes frustrating, and you take on more than you admit, and you don't ask for help easily, and you have 3 different ways of being quiet depending on what kind of thing you're not saying, and I know all 3 of them by now." He paused. "I love you. I have loved you for most of this year, and I have tried to be patient about it and not push you into anything, and I think I've mostly succeeded at that. But I've spent the last 6 months watching you run this ranch and fight for this land, and figure out how to trust someone again after a long time of not trusting anyone, and I don't want to be a hired man here anymore." She looked at him. "I want to be your husband," he said. "If you'll have me." The barn was very quiet. The heifer shifted in the stall. Somewhere above them, the wind moved across the roof. The sounds of the ranch, perfectly ordinary, going on without them. Marietta stood in front of him and felt everything at once, the warmth and the fear and the grief for Thomas. That was not the same as grief for this moment, the two things not fighting each other the way she had once thought they would, just existing side by side the way things do when you're a person with a long enough history that loss and possibility have learned to occupy the same space. "You know," she said, "you said I was stubborn." "I did. And you're asking me anyway." "I'm asking you because of it, partly." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "I never wanted someone simple." She looked at him standing in her barn holding his hat, 25 years old and completely certain, and she thought about February and the calving and 2 cups of coffee and a mortgage agreement read page by page in a lamplight kitchen and a letter from the alderman operation and the east fence repaired and Thomas's chair and all of it. The whole weight and texture of a year that had not been easy and had not been perfect and had been, she understood now, exactly what she hadn't known she was waiting for. "I will be 43 in the spring," she said. "I know the arithmetic," he said. "I've known it since February." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. Just once, just a single exhale. But she heard everything in it, everything he'd been holding while he waited for that word. Everything patient and certain and real. "Yes," she said again, because it bore saying twice. He stepped forward and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the barn in the winter dark while the cattle settled around them and the wind moved over the ranch outside, and the spring in the high pasture ran on steadily through the frozen ground. And she thought, "This is not how I expected my life to go, and it is better than what I expected, and I'm going to stop being surprised by that and simply be grateful for it." She did not say that out loud. Some things fit better in the quiet. The news moved through Dry Creek. The way news always moved through Dry Creek, faster than anyone could explain. And with details that were approximately correct, which was the best you could hope for. Reactions varied. Agnes Miller said, at moderate volume in the dry goods store, that it was about time and that Marietta Vale had more sense in one practical decision than most of the town combined. Agnes then purchased her usual supplies and left, her opinion delivered and complete. Dora Hutchins said nothing directly to Marietta, but stopped manufacturing reasons for delayed deliveries, which was its own kind of statement. Reverend Holloway came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in December, which was unexpected. He sat at Marietta's kitchen table and accepted coffee and was quiet for a moment before he said, "I said something in September that I have been regretting since approximately September." "You said it carefully," Marietta said. "Not as an absolution, just as a fact." "I said it wrong," he said. "I let other people's assumptions shape my thinking, and I put them in your direction, and that was not fair and not correct of me." He paused. "I'd like to perform the ceremony, if you'd have me." "If that seems like too much to ask given the circumstances, I understand that too." Marietta looked at him. He was a man who had been in Dry Creek for 15 years and who had conducted Thomas's funeral with genuine care, and he was sitting at her table looking genuinely uncomfortable with his own previous behavior, which was the closest thing to humility she was likely to get from him. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He thanked her for the coffee and left. Callum, who had been silent throughout, looked at her after the door closed. "Are you actually going to think about it?" "I've already thought about it," she said. "The answer's yes. He made a mistake, and he came here to own it. That's more than most people do." Callum nodded. He picked up his coffee. "You're not an easy woman," he said. But he said it in the tone that meant he had decided long ago that this was precisely what he wanted. The hardest conversation came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She was in town 3 days before Christmas, picking up supplies, when a man she didn't immediately recognize stopped her on the street. He was perhaps 50, weathered, with the build of a man who had spent his life doing physical work, and the careful politeness of someone who has thought about what he wants to say before he says it. He took off his hat. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "my name is Dorian Rourke. I'm Callum's uncle. His father was my brother." She stood on the street in the cold December air and looked at him. "He wrote to me," Dorian said. "When he sent the letter, I wasn't sure I should come, but I thought—" He stopped, started again. "His mother passed 2 years ago. She's gone, and his father's been gone since Callum was 11. I'm what's left of his family on that side. I just wanted to see for myself." "See what for yourself?" she said. He met her eyes directly. "That he's all right. That it's real." He paused. He hasn't had much that was real. Growing up the way he did, moving around, I wasn't close enough to help, and I've always felt the weight of that. He looked at his hat in his hands. He seems happy. In the letter. Happier than I've known him to sound. Marietta stood on the street for a moment. "Come to the ranch on Saturday," she said. "We'll have dinner. You can see for yourself." He came on Saturday. He was quiet at dinner but present, the kind of man who takes things in carefully before he speaks, which she recognized because she had hired his nephew without fully realizing she was recognizing the family trait. He and Callum talked in the careful way of people who have a shared history that has gaps in it, working around the gaps without making too much of them, finding the solid ground between. After dinner, while Callum was outside checking the last of the evening, Dorian Rourke sat at her kitchen table and looked at the room, at the tin box of receipts, at the account books, at the chair at the end of the table that Callum had still never sat in. "He wrote about the mortgage business," Dorian said, "what that man Vardell tried to do, and what Callum found in the agreement." "He saved the ranch," Marietta said. "The receipt mattered, but if he hadn't read that agreement, I might not have known what Vardell's notice actually violated." Dorian was quiet for a moment. "His mother lost a house," he said finally, "when his father died. There was debt she didn't understand and men who counted on her not understanding it. I tried to help, but I was too far away and I didn't know enough myself and she lost it." He looked at his hands on the table. He would have been 13. I always wondered what he carried from that. "He carried it into reading every piece of paper he could find," Marietta said, "and knowing his rights, and knowing mine when it mattered." Dorian looked at her. He had the same quality of directness his nephew had, that ability to look at something plainly without flinching from it. "He made a good choice," he said, "staying here." "I think so," she said. "I mean about you," he said. "Not just the ranch." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, because it was simply meant. Callum came back in and found them sitting quietly at the table, and whatever he read in the shape of that quiet seemed to satisfy him, because he relaxed in a way she could feel from across the room, a tension he'd been carrying since Saturday morning releasing from his shoulders. They had coffee and a piece of dried apple pie that Marietta had made Thursday because she'd had the time and the inclination, and not for any special occasion, just because it was something to do on a cold evening. Dorian Rourke left after dark with a handshake for Callum that lasted longer than most handshakes do, and a nod to Marietta that carried a weight of meaning she understood without needing it translated. When she closed the door, she stood for a moment with her hand on the latch. Callum was behind her in the kitchen. "He liked you," he said. "I know. He doesn't like people easily. I know that too." She turned around. "Family trait, apparently." He almost laughed. "Apparently." She looked at him across the kitchen where she had first made 2 cups of coffee by accident and first understood what that accident meant. The kitchen with Thomas's chair at the end of the table that she had begun, slowly and without ceremony, to think of differently. Not as a place she needed to protect, but as a place that held something she could choose to move forward from. She was going to marry this man in the spring. She was 42 years old, and she had buried her husband and fought for her land and rebuilt what she could rebuild, and managed her grief and her accounts and her reputation and her heart with the same stubborn competence she brought to everything. And in the spring, she was going to stand on her own ranch with the people who mattered and make a choice that the younger version of herself, the one who had thought the story had already been written, would not have believed was still available to her. She was going to plant something new in ground she had already paid for with everything she had. It was not a small thing. She did not treat it like a small thing. "Come have coffee," she said to Callum. He came and had coffee. Outside, the Wyoming winter moved over the ranch the way it always had, cold and total and indifferent to human plans. And inside the kitchen, the lamp burned and the accounts were closed for the night, and there were 2 cups on the table, which was how it had been for months now, which was how it would continue to be. The winter of 1888 was harder than the previous one, which Marietta had not thought possible, and which Wyoming delivered anyway, with the particular indifference of a landscape that has no interest in human expectation. It came in January with 3 consecutive storms that shut the roads for 11 days and drove the temperature low enough that the water in the barn buckets froze solid overnight, regardless of how recently it had been replaced. The cattle needed checking twice in the dark hours, which meant someone was always up, always moving, always doing the cold, unromantic work of keeping living things alive through conditions designed to kill them. Marietta and Callum divided the nights without discussion. She took the early check, he took the late one, and whoever was up when the other came in made sure there was something warm to come back to. It was not elegant. None of it was. There were mornings when she was so tired she couldn't entirely feel her hands, and mornings when he came in from the 2 a.m. check with ice in his beard and the particular emptied expression of a man running on will rather than energy, and they would sit at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn and drink bad coffee and not say much because there was not much to say, just the work and the next piece of work and the piece after that. She thought sometimes, in those mornings, that this was what people never saw when they imagined a life on a ranch in Wyoming. They imagined something with cleaner edges, the open space, the independence, the freedom from the crowded complications of city life. They did not imagine the ice in the barn and the frozen pump handle and the cattle that died anyway despite everything you did, because winter in Wyoming took a percentage and there was nothing to negotiate about it. 2 calves died in January. The first was young and had come early and weak, and Marietta sat with it for 3 hours in the barn trying to give it what warmth and care she had. And it died anyway at 4 in the morning while Callum sat on the other side of the stall, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing useful to say. The second was lost to a complication she couldn't have prevented. She buried them both in the frozen ground east of the barn, the way she had buried losses before, and she felt the weight of it, the way she always felt it, fully, without trying to make it smaller than it was. And then she went back to work because the living animals still needed her. Callum watched her through all of this, not with pity, which she could not have tolerated, but with the particular attention of a man who understands that the person beside him is doing something genuinely hard and respects the doing of it without needing to fix it. "You don't have to be fine about it," he said once, the evening after the second calf. "I'm not fine about it," she said. "I'm working. That's different." He accepted that. She was grateful he accepted it. February arrived, and with it a break in the storms. Just enough warmth returning to the air to make the roads passable again, and the ranch work slightly less like a sustained argument with the fundamental hostility of the natural world. The anniversary of Callum's arrival at Silver Briar came and went without ceremony. Neither of them marked it aloud, but Marietta was aware of it, aware of the distance between who she had been when she watched a roan horse come through her gate and who she was now, standing in the same yard, engaged to the man who had been on that horse. A year. It had been a year more or less, and the ranch was still standing and she was still standing, and those two facts seemed larger to her than perhaps they would to someone who hadn't spent the previous 3 years wondering whether either would remain true. She thought about Thomas sometimes, the way she always had and probably always would, but the nature of the thinking had changed. It no longer had the quality of a door kept closed because opening it was too much. It had become more like a room she could move through, a space that held what it held without demanding that she stay in it. She did not know exactly when that had shifted. She thought it had happened gradually, the way most things that matter actually change, not in a moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary days in which she had allowed herself to be present in her own life, instead of standing guard against it. She did not tell this to Callum in those words. But one evening in late February, she went to the kitchen table and she put her hands on the back of Thomas's chair, the chair at the end of the table that had stood empty for a year while Callum worked around it, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Callum, who was at the other side of the table with the account books. "Sit here tonight," she said. He looked up. He understood immediately what she meant. She could see it in his face. He had always understood the significance of that chair, had understood it from the first week without being told. He was still for a moment. "Are you sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. "It's a chair. It's my chair, and I'd like you to sit in it." He came around the table and sat in it. She sat across from him. They worked through the accounts together that evening, the same way they always did, and the chair was just a chair and Thomas was still Thomas, present in the photographs on the shelf and in the way she had learned to run this ranch, and in the love she had carried for years, that had not diminished simply because she had chosen to carry something else alongside it. Grief and possibility. She had learned they could coexist. It had taken her a while to stop being surprised by that. March came with mud and the first tentative warmth in the beginning of calving season, which arrived with its usual combination of exhaustion and renewal and occasional emergency. The first healthy calf of 1888 was born on a Thursday night, no complications, the heifer doing the work herself by the time Marietta got to the barn, and Callum came in 5 minutes later, and they stood together watching the calf find its legs, while the cow attended to it with the single-minded focus of a new mother who has forgotten everything else exists. "Better than last year's first night," Callum said. "Considerably," she agreed. He looked at her in the barn light. "You remember what you said that first morning, after the calving?" "I said a lot of things." "You said most hired men want to take over, that they see a woman struggling and assume the answer is to handle it for her." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot. Whether I've done that. Whether I've handled things for you when I shouldn't have." She considered it honestly, because he was asking honestly. "No," she said. "You haven't. You've done your work. Sometimes that work overlapped with mine, but you never made me feel like the work was being taken from me." She looked at the calf. "That's rarer than it sounds." He nodded. He seemed satisfied with that, not in a self-congratulatory way, but in the way of a man who had been genuinely concerned about a thing and was relieved to have it addressed plainly. "Spring wedding," she said. "Reverend Holloway asked about a date." "What did you tell him?" "I told him May, after the worst of calving is through and before the summer work gets ahead of us." She glanced at him. "Is that all right with you?" "May is fine," he said. "Nothing fancy," she said. "I don't want anything fancy. I want the people who matter, and a day that means something." "That's exactly what I want," he said. She believed him. She had learned over a year to believe him when he said things simply and without decoration, because that was how he said everything that was true. April brought an unexpected development from a direction neither of them had been watching. A wagon arrived at Silver Briar on a Wednesday morning, driven by a man from the Vardell operation. Not Vardell himself, one of his workers, a middle-aged man named Geary, who Marietta had seen in town occasionally, and who had always seemed to her like a man slightly uncomfortable with the company he was paid to keep. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and climbed down with the careful movements of a person who is uncertain of their reception. "Mrs. Vale," he said. He took off his hat. "Mr. Vardell sent this." He gestured to the back of the wagon. There was lumber. Good quality lumber. She could see from where she stood. The kind of boards you didn't find at the local mill. The kind that came from further away and cost accordingly. She looked at the lumber. She looked at Geary. "Why?" she said. Geary held his hat. "He didn't say exactly, ma'am. He said to deliver it and give you this." He held out a folded piece of paper. She took the paper and opened it. The handwriting was Vardell's. She had seen it on legal documents enough to know it. The note was short. It said, "For whatever repairs the property requires this spring. No terms attached." That was all. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened between them over the previous year. Just lumber and 3 words, no terms attached. She stood in the yard holding the note for a moment. Callum came around the side of the barn and saw the wagon. He looked at the lumber, then at her, then at the note she was holding. She handed it to him. He read it. He said. "Yes," she said. "Are you going to take it?" She thought about it. She thought about Silas Vardell sitting in his large house, doing whatever calculation men like Silas Vardell do when a particular strategy has failed and they are reassessing. The lumber was not generosity. She was not naive enough to call it that. It was something more complicated. It was a man of significant pride finding the smallest possible gesture that allowed him to move forward from a position without fully acknowledging that the position had been wrong. It was the closest thing to backing down that his nature could produce. She could reject it. She had every right to reject it, and nobody who knew the history would have thought less of her for it. But the ranch could use the lumber. The east barn roof that Callum had braced in the fall had made it through the winter, but barely. A proper fix was on the spring work list, and the cost of the materials had been sitting in the back of her mind since January. And taking it, she thought, was its own kind of statement. It said, "I don't need your approval, and I don't need your friendship, and I don't hold what you tried to do, but I'm also not going to perform a grudge when there's work to be done on my property." "Unload it," she said to Geary. He looked relieved. He unloaded it, stacking the lumber neatly by the barn the way she directed, and when he was done, he put his hat back on and climbed up on the wagon and drove back down the Silver Briar Road without another word. Marietta and Callum stood looking at the stack of lumber. "He'll never say it out loud," she said. "What he tried to do. He'll never acknowledge it directly." "No," Callum agreed. "I can live with that," she said. "I don't need him to say it. I know what happened and I know what we did about it, and the ranch is still mine, and that's the part that matters." Callum looked at her. "You're a harder person to beat than he expected." "I'm a harder person to beat than most people expect," she said. "I've noticed that tends to be the case with people who get underestimated for a long time." He smiled. A real one. Not the almost smile she saw more often, but the full version, which she had come to understand was something he gave rarely and meant completely. They went and had coffee. The wedding happened on a Saturday in mid-May, which arrived with the kind of Wyoming spring day that makes you understand why people stay in Wyoming despite everything Wyoming does to them. The air clear and cold in the morning, warming through the midday to something genuinely mild, the hills showing their first real green of the year, the sky the particular blue that exists only at altitude in the early weeks of warmth. Marietta wore a dress she had made herself, which she had worked on during the quiet evenings of March and April in the kitchen after the accounts were done. It was not elaborate. She was 43 years old and she was getting married on her own ranch, and she did not need to dress like anything other than what she was. The dress was good wool in a blue-gray that she had always liked and that Callum had mentioned once in passing suited her. She had not told him she noticed. She had bought the fabric 3 days later. The people who came were not everyone in Dry Creek. They were the people who mattered. Agnes Mueller was there, in her best coat, sitting in the front with the authority of a woman who has earned the right to occupy any space she chooses. Reverend Holloway was there to conduct the ceremony, which he did with a sincerity she was willing to accept as genuine. Harlan Webb had driven up from the county seat, which surprised her until she remembered that Webb was a man who liked seeing the conclusions of things he'd been part of, and he had been part of this one. Dorian Rourke was there. He had come a long way, 3 days' travel, and he stood near Callum with the quietly proud expression of a man who has been given the opportunity to do right by family at a late hour and has taken it. A handful of neighbors came, including the Mueller boy and his wife and old Pete Ferris, who had run cattle adjacent to Silver Briar for 20 years and who had said nothing during the worst of the town's whispering, which Marietta now understood to have been its own kind of loyalty from a man of few words. Martha Collins from the dry goods store came and sat in the back with the expression of a woman who has quietly revised her position on a matter and is not going to make a speech about it, which Marietta respected. The ceremony was held outside in front of the house, with the barn behind them and the hills beyond that and the upper pasture out of sight above, but present in the way the spring was always present. You couldn't see it from here, but you knew it was running, you knew the water was moving, and that knowledge was its own kind of comfort. Reverend Holloway said the words. When he reached the part that asked whether she took this man, Marietta looked at Callum and felt the full reality of the moment land on her without evasion. He was standing in front of her in a clean shirt and his good jacket, his hat off, his hair decently managed for once, and he was looking at her the way he looked at her when he was being most completely himself. Without performance, without qualification, just straight and present and sure. She said yes. He said yes. Holloway pronounced them married, and there was a small sound from the assembled group. Not a cheer exactly, but the collective exhale of people who have been holding something and can release it now. Agnes Mueller said audibly, "Finally," and a few people laughed, including Marietta, which she hadn't expected to do. The wedding supper was in the kitchen and the yard, with tables carried outside and food that a surprising number of people had brought without being asked, pies and bread, and smoked meat, and a cake from Agnes that was lopsided on one side and tasted better than anything Marietta had eaten in months. People ate and talked, and the evening came slowly, the way May evenings do, with the light holding long past when you expected it to go. At some point, Dorian Rourke found her standing at the edge of the yard looking out at the lower pasture, and he stood beside her for a moment in the way of a man who wants to say something and is choosing how. He wrote to me last spring, Dorian said, right about the time the trouble with Vardell was starting. He didn't say much about it. He's not a man who asks for help easily. But reading between what he wrote, I could tell the ranch was in difficulty, and he was worried about you. He didn't tell me he wrote to you, she said. I didn't think he had. Dorian looked at the hills. He was 11 when his father died. I've told you that. What I didn't say is that for the 2 years after, before his mother moved the first time, I saw him fairly regularly, and he was a boy who made himself very quiet, very quickly, when things got hard. Like he'd decided that needing things was dangerous, so he was going to need as few things as possible. He paused. I watched him at supper tonight. He's not quiet like that anymore. Marietta thought about February in the barn, the first calving, Callum holding the animal steady and waiting for her to lead. She thought about the way he'd read the mortgage agreement at midnight because he needed to understand it. She thought about the letter he'd turned down without drama, just a decision made and handed to her to post. He found his footing, she said. You gave him ground to find it on, Dorian said. She was quiet for a moment. He gave me ground too. I think it worked both ways. Dorian nodded. He had the same quality of hearing things fully that his nephew had, that willingness to take in what was said without immediately filling the space with a response. Take care of him, he said finally. Not in a protective way, not the way a person says it when they doubt the recipient's intentions, but in the way you say it to someone you trust, as a genuine expression of what you hope. I intend to, she said. He's irritating sometimes, you know. He's stubborn, and he doesn't admit when he's tired. Dorian smiled. Family trait. I noticed. He laughed, a real one, and went back toward the supper tables, and Marietta stood for another moment in the May evening, looking at her land and thinking that whatever she had expected her life to look like at 43, it had not looked like this, and she was grateful for the failure of her own imagination. The seasons moved through 18888, the way seasons do when you are busy living in them. Not slowly and not quickly, just steadily, one piece of necessary work following another. The summer was still dry because the valley's water problems were not solved by one better winter, and Callum managed the upper spring with the same careful attention he'd brought to it the previous year. But the registered water rights were in order, Vardell had made no further moves, and Silver Briar's position in the valley was more settled than it had been in years. There was a difficult week in August when a section of the south fence failed, and they lost 6 cattle to a neighboring property and had to negotiate their return, which involved a conversation with the neighbor that was civil but not pleasant, and which ultimately cost her both the fence repair and a day of riding she couldn't entirely spare. She was short-tempered for 2 days after, in the specific way of a person who has resolved a problem efficiently but is still paying the emotional cost of it, and Callum stayed out of the direct path of her temper and left a pot of coffee ready on the stove both mornings and said nothing that wasn't necessary. On the 3rd day, she said, I was difficult this week. You were tired and frustrated, he said. It's not the same thing. It felt the same thing from the inside. I know, but it wasn't. He looked at her. You handled the fence. You got the cattle back. You had a hard week, and now it's over. She thought about this. You don't keep score, she said. No. Most people keep score. I know most people do. He picked up his coffee. I don't see the point of it. You're not keeping score on me either. That's why it works. She considered that. It was true. She did not keep score. She had not realized until he named it that this was an active choice she was making, but it was the choice to let a hard week be a hard week and not a mark in a ledger, the choice to treat a person as a complete thing and not a running total of their failures and their debts to you. She had not been able to do that with everyone. She was not sure she could do it with everyone. But with Callum, it came naturally in a way that had surprised her at first, and then become simply the shape of how they were with each other. I know, she said. It does work. He smiled at his coffee. But the final mortgage payment came in November of 1889. Not the 2nd year of their marriage. She had not tracked it by that measure. She had tracked it by the 6-year record in the account books, the columns of figures that represented the accumulated work of Thomas's years and her years and the year and a half of their years. The number had been sitting at the back of every financial calculation she had made since she inherited the debt along with the land, and now it was paid, and the ranch was fully and completely theirs in a way that no piece of paper held by any other person could complicate. She had been expecting to feel something large when it happened. She had been half expecting to cry, which was not her typical response to things, but which seemed like it might be appropriate given the scale of what the payment represented. What she actually felt was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door that has been slightly ajar for a long time finally clicking shut, not dramatically, just settling into place. She sat at the kitchen table with the paid receipt in front of her and Callum across from her with his coffee, and she looked at the receipt for a while. "That's it," she said. "That's it," he agreed. 6 years. 6 years. She set the receipt down. She looked at him. He was 26 now, 26 and sitting in Thomas's old chair at the end of her table, which was their table now, which had been their table since the evening she'd asked him to sit there, and he'd understood immediately what she was giving and had accepted it with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything she gave him. "I want to show you something," she said. She went to the high shelf above the pantry, where she kept the things that didn't belong anywhere else, an old photograph, Thomas's watch, a small tin she had never opened in front of anyone, not even Callum. She took down the tin and brought it to the table. Inside was a folded cloth, and inside the cloth were seeds, dozens of them, small and dark, carefully saved and wrapped by a woman who had known how to keep things for a long time. Callum looked at the seeds. He looked at her. "My mother's," she said. "She gave them to me when Thomas and I left for Wyoming. Wild columbine and prairie rose, and a few things I don't even have names for anymore. She grew them in her garden in Missouri, and she kept seeds every year." She touched the cloth gently. "She said to plant them somewhere that felt like home." Callum was quiet. "I kept waiting to feel settled enough," Marietta said. "The first years with Thomas, I kept thinking, well, next year, when things are more stable. And then Thomas got sick, and then he died, and after that it felt wrong, somehow. Like planting something beautiful was too much of a statement about the future. Like I didn't have the right to make that kind of statement." She folded the cloth back over the seeds. "I think I'm ready to plant them," she said. Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "In the spring, along the porch rail maybe. You'd see them from the kitchen window." "Yes," she said. "That's what I was thinking." She put the tin on the shelf where she could see it through the winter, and that evening she sat on her side of their table and worked the accounts with the easy comfort of a woman who knows what her numbers mean and is no longer afraid of them, while Callum sat at the other end reading a letter from Dorian with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has figured out, finally, that staying somewhere doesn't require you to stop being yourself. It had taken him a long time to learn that. It had taken her a long time to learn that staying somewhere worth staying was not the same as giving up on the possibility of more. Both of them, in their different ways, had spent years running from the same thing. The vulnerability of belonging somewhere enough that losing it would cost you everything. She did not think that fear ever fully went away. She thought it sat with you for your whole life, and the question was just whether you let it make your decisions or whether you made them yourself and let it ride along in the back, where it belonged. The porch rail in May of 1890. Marietta was on her knees in the dirt with a small trowel, making the shallow rows that the seeds required, and Callum was behind her on the porch steps with his coffee, watching her work. The morning was cool and bright in the way of Wyoming in early May, when the sun has promised but hasn't committed to warmth yet, and the hills behind the ranch were showing the first serious green of the season. She worked carefully. Her mother had told her these seeds wanted to be planted shallow, barely covered, just enough soil to hold them against the wind, because they were hardy things that didn't need to be buried deep to take hold. She had remembered that across 30 years and 2 states and a marriage and a loss, and a winter that had almost taken the ranch, and a mortgage that someone powerful had tried to use as a weapon. She planted every one of them. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the turned earth along the porch rail, plain and dark and not much to look at yet, the way the beginning of most things isn't much to look at yet. "How long before they come up?" Callum said from the steps. "Weeks, if the soil's right and we don't get another hard frost." She stood, brushing the dirt from her knees. "My mother said they're stubborn growers. Once they take hold, they come back every year." "That suits you," he said. She looked at him. "Does it?" "Stubborn," he said, "comes back every year." That's possibly the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me on a May morning. Is it wrong, though? She thought about it. She thought about February in a barn and a midnight calving and 2 cups of coffee made by accident and a mortgage agreement read by lamplight and a letter declined without drama and a chair that had been empty for a year before she was ready to offer it again. "No," she said. "It's not wrong." He stood up from the steps and came to stand beside her, and they looked at the plain strip of turned earth along the porch rail, and it was not beautiful yet. It was just dirt and possibility, the way most things that eventually matter start out. But the seeds were in the ground, and the ground was hers, and the man beside her had chosen her with his eyes open to every complicated piece of who she was, and she had chosen him the same way. She did not need the flowers to be there yet. She knew they were coming. But by June, the first shoots appeared, thin and green and tentative, pushing up through the soil along the porch rail with the uncomplicated persistence of living things that simply intend to grow. Marietta found them on a Thursday morning when she went out for the early check. She stood on the porch and looked at them for a moment before she did anything else. She called Callum. He came out of the barn and looked where she was pointing and said, "Good," in the same tone he used for things that were genuinely good and didn't need more words than that. She agreed with him. They had coffee on the porch that morning, which they sometimes did in the summer when the early light was worth sitting in. The lower pasture was green and the cattle were moving in the way of animals that are well. The spring in the upper pasture was running with the sound of it just audible. If you were quiet, the hills beyond the ranch were the particular shade of early summer that always struck her as improbable, too saturated to be believed, the kind of color that makes you think the world is trying to tell you something about the value of paying attention. She had been on this land for 9 years. She had been afraid for most of them, afraid of the debt, afraid of the winters, afraid of losing the ranch, and afraid, once Thomas died, of losing herself inside her own grief. And then she had been afraid of something different, afraid of choosing again, afraid of what it cost to let a person matter, afraid of arithmetic and age and what other people would make of her decisions. She thought now that the fear had not been wrong, exactly. It had not been a character flaw or an error. Fear of real loss is honest, and the losses had been real. Yuta did not get through what she had gotten through without understanding exactly what the stakes were. But she had learned, slowly, through a year of coffee and account books and calving emergencies and mortgage agreements and a town's opinion and a spring that kept running when everything else was running dry, that fear could be carried along rather than surrendered to, that it did not have to be the last word, that the braver thing was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it, toward the things that mattered, toward the people who deserved your trust, toward the future that was still being written even when you were 42 years old and tired, and certain the important chapters were already finished. She had been wrong about that. She was glad to have been wrong about it. Well, in the summer of 1890, Marietta Rourke sat on the porch of the ranch she owned debt-free and watched the flowers her mother had given her bloom along the rail, columbine in purple and white, something she eventually identified as wild rose, and 3 or 4 things that had no names she knew but opened in the morning and closed at evening and were in the meantime very beautiful. Callum came and sat beside her in the evenings the way he had since the previous spring, and they talked about ranch business and the cattle numbers and the water situation in the valley and the letter Dorian had sent from 3 counties away, and 100 small things that were the actual substance of a life shared between 2 people who have decided to share one. They did not always agree. She was stubborn, and he was stubborn, and there were evenings when one of them was wrong about something, and neither immediately conceded it, and the kitchen had its moments of friction and occasional silence that was not the comfortable kind. She lost her temper about the south fence again in July, a different problem, the same basic capacity for frustration. He went through a week in August where something was bothering him that he didn't articulate quickly, and she had to wait him out until he was ready to say it, and waiting was not her strongest skill. None of it was perfect. It was better than perfect. It was real, which is the thing that perfect is always sacrificed for when people have the sense to make that trade. Marietta had lived long enough to know the difference. She sat on the porch in the summer evening with the flowers blooming along the rail and the land paid for, and the man she had chosen beside her, and she thought about her mother handing her a tin of seeds and saying, "Plant them somewhere that feels like home." She had spent 9 years in Wyoming thinking she would know that feeling when she found it, that it would announce itself, arrive with some certainty that distinguished it from mere familiarity or endurance. She had not known until she planted the seeds and watched them come up, that home was not a feeling you found. It was a feeling you built, slowly, out of hard winters survived and losses grieved and work done and trust given carefully to the right people and choices made in full knowledge of what they cost. She had built this. Not alone. She had not built it alone, and she knew better than to tell the story that way. Thomas had built the first part of it with her. Callum had come along when the part she was trying to build by herself was starting to fail, and he had not taken it over. He had simply stood beside her and helped her finish it. That was the thing about the right kind of partnership. It did not diminish you. It did not require you to be less than you were so that the other person could be more. It said, I see what you're building, and I think it's worth building, and I would like to help, if you'll have me. She had taken a long time to say yes to that offer. She thought the delay had been understandable. She also thought she was glad, in the end, that she had said it. The evening light moved across the valley below the porch, gold going to amber, going to the long shadow of Wyoming summer dusk. And somewhere in the upper pasture, the spring ran on with the quiet persistence of water that has found its course and intends to keep it. And the flowers along the rail held the last of the light in their petals, the way flowers do when they are briefly, genuinely, unambiguously alive. Marietta Rourke had been a widow who thought the story was over. She had been wrong, and it was the best wrong she had ever been, and she would not have traded it for the comfort of having been right. She stayed. That, in the end, was the whole of it. She chose to stay, and she built something worth staying for, and the flowers came back every year after that, stubborn and bright, and entirely indifferent to anyone's expectation of what ought to be possible, just like her.